Welcome everyone to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. I'm San Francisco Chronicle columnist Heather Knight, and I'll be your moderator for a great discussion today entitled No Place to Shelter, What COVID-19 Reveals About Inequality. Joining me is Conor Dougherty, a reporter for the New York Times and the author of Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. I'll also be talking with Zach Norris, executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and the author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, and Joe Wilson, executive director of Hospitality House, a homeless shelter and service provider in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood. So wanted to start by just giving you guys some feelings I've been having as a columnist covering San Francisco for the past couple of months, which now feels like about a decade. But of course, inequality was always a very stark issue in San Francisco and the Bay Area, especially in recent years with the economic boom. But I feel like the virus has definitely exacerbated that. I've been thinking a lot about how we were already kind of a modern day tale of two cities. And now it seems like it's even more so. We have some neighborhoods where most people can still work from home. Their kids have Wi-Fi and laptops and can do all the virtual learning that's required right now. And we can go outside for exercise on streets that are closed, and parks are right here, and everything's, not fun, but it's kind of humming along. And then there's other neighborhoods in San Francisco, most notably the Tenderloin, where that is really far from the truth. I was just there yesterday. There are now 450 tents filling the sidewalks. It's impossible to social distance. Some families have not left their SRO hotel rooms in months because they don't feel safe going outside. We now have 1 in 7 San Franciscans is unemployed. Others have seen their hours cut or have been furloughed. So there's just a lot to talk about on this issue of inequality and the virus. And Joe, I wanted to start with you, partly because I love interviewing you, done it before several times, and you never mince your words. So I just wondered if you can describe what it's been like in the Tenderloin lately, what you're seeing day to day, and how you're thinking about this issue of inequality, which seems to be getting just worse and worse.
Well, that certainly sums it up, Heather. Thank you. It's hard to feel positive about what we've seen, just kind of this stark reality of injustice kind of all around us. We can appreciate that this crisis is unprecedented, and many of our systems just been proven to be woefully unprepared for the depth of it. But, there's nothing positive in seeing just the stark reality of, homelessness, poverty, suffering, racism, oppression in so many ways. And, it's hard to be able to rationalize how, the value that's placed on some lives versus others. And we see that very clearly in our collective response to dealing with this public health crisis, particularly providing housing options for people who deserve them and are at the most at risk during this crisis. We have chosen not to do that. And it's at some point we cannot rationalize the inequity that we're perpetuating, even in our response to this unprecedented crisis, where we are assigning a relative value to poor people and homeless people versus everyone else. And as a part of the city's human services infrastructure, I feel a little saddened by my part in this. Our organization has been around 50 plus years. We've accomplished some good things over that span of time, but it's hard to feel anything positive really in what we've seen with the pick a word, ineptitude, callousness, hypocrisy, all of it rolled into one in our lack of responsiveness toward addressing poverty and homelessness, in the midst of this crisis.
Mm-hmm. You say callousness. Do you think that leaders are intentionally ignoring the Tenderloin, or what is the reason for their inability to get a handle on this after 10 weeks? They've had quite a long time to find some answers.
It feels at a certain point, when you look outside and you see how many people are, trying to carve out a hardscrabble existence on our sidewalks. These people did not just appear overnight. Folks have been grappling with poverty and homelessness for quite some time. We've had an opportunity individually and collectively as a city to address it for quite some time. We have not. Mm-hmm. And when you see responses like we have an opportunity to house people in hotel rooms to at least give people to a modicum of safety, but we've chosen instead to erect thinly disguised open-air quarantine sites and calling them safe villages, safe sleeping sites. It gets very difficult to view that as anything more than a hard decision made about the relative value of homeless people's lives compared to everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And Zach, have you spent any time in the Tenderloin lately, or have any thoughts on how that neighborhood is, what we're seeing in that neighborhood versus other neighborhoods in San Francisco?
The history of the Tenderloin, like the history of so many neighborhoods in the Bay Area, is one of intentional exclusion, of discrimination. And I think what I would add to your summation of this tale of two cities is just the addition of criminalization, right? We see it in New York as well, where you see one photo of New York police officers passing out masks to white folks enjoying Central Park, and another photo of police officers with their knees on the necks of folks in New York. And we just saw what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. And so this isn't unique to the Bay Area, but I think we shouldn't just start this conversation with COVID or even immediately before COVID. I think in California, we have to start this story at least in the late 1970s, when there was a decision to pass Proposition 13, which really decimated the state's tax base, hurt working families across the state. And at that same time, California's prison guard union was going from one city to another, saying, we have a new economic engine that will bring some jobs to your locality, and it is called a prison. And so from 1980 to 2000, we built some 23 new prisons and just one new university. And that decision and those series of decisions really leave us where we are now, where we have a real propensity to utilize a criminal dragnet and no effective social safety net. And so at our organization at the Ella Baker Center, we talk about the need to advance a books not bars, housing not handcuffs, jobs not jails agenda. And we say that we should have public health solutions for public health issues, right? So rather than criminalizing students in a school, let's actually provide them with counseling. Rather than criminalizing homelessness, let's actually provide housing. Rather than criminalizing drug use and abuse, let's actually provide treatment for folks who are struggling with those issues. I never thought in all my years that I would have to say we also need public health solutions to a global pandemic. But if you listen to what's coming out of the White House, you see some of those same echoes of scapegoating and criminalization, even in this context of a virus that can impact all of us. That there are some of those same racial tropes being thrown out to really blame and shame certain communities rather than dealing with the public health issue that is in front of us. And that's really tragic, but I do think that there is possibility for change.
Mm-hmm. And so far, it's appearing that essential workers, including Latino people and African Americans, are more likely to get the virus, which further exacerbates all of these other issues that you're speaking of.
1,000%. Yep.
Yeah. And Conor, what are your initial thoughts on how San Francisco and the Bay Area are coping with COVID-19? It got a lot of credit in the beginning for, Mayor Breed and others in the Bay Area and ordering an immediate shelter in place and being ahead of the game on that. And yet now we're seeing so many places that they haven't focused on, including homelessness. Just wanted to get your initial thoughts in this discussion about that.
So, as I kind of documented in the book, I was, it's kind of funny, I joked to my publisher that my next book would be called The Last Book Tour, because I was like on the road when the COVID I was in Portland actually when the world just kind of shut down and I came back. And so I think in a way, I've been thinking about how our housing crisis was kind of a baseline for, we had a housing crisis before, obviously, and COVID lays on top of that baseline and and sort of exposes one more thing, exposing how inept and bad that that sort of situation was already. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say that all I see is that housing has been a failure at pretty much every level. I think we have about 1 in 4 people who are eligible for a voucher can get one. The affordable housing is built, at a rate, I think it usually is 10 to 20 times, sometimes many more than that, the number of applicants as there are space for them. And on top of that, it costs a lot of money to build affordable housing, and it's opposed, and so it takes many years more than it should. I mean, and so whether it's state policy or federal policy or city policy, we don't have enough housing and enough affordable housing to meet the need. And what I think has happened is, Zach was talking about the late 70s, and one of the things I thought was so fascinating about that period is the late 70s are kind of the time when essentially everything went wrong in America. It's when unionization started to go on a precipitous decline. It's when CEO pay took off at much more than the rate of the lowest paid worker. It's when housing became very expensive. It's when financialization of the economy became a bigger share of, the banks became a bigger share of what did we even produced. And we've seen kind of crisis after crisis after crisis that's, often related to that. And so I think where that's left us, particularly in the Bay Area, is that we have, and this is true California-wide, a very low household formation rate, which basically means we have a lot of crowded housing. And what we've learned in New York and a lot of other places is that crowded housing turns out to be considerably less safe than non-crowded housing. It turns out, and it turns out that the people you pass on the street, though obviously if you're in crowded public transit or something like that, your risk of exposure is higher. But that turns out to be less important than coming home to a place with 10, 12 people, as we see in places like East Palo Alto. And what's actually fascinating is the density turns out to be not that important. Manhattan has fairly low COVID rates, all things considered, but Queens has very high rates. And that's because a lot of those units have, tons of people in them. And even, I've only seen this in a couple instances, but it looks like affordable housing, even if it has the same, disproportionately lower income people in them, seems to have very low rates. So I think that this crisis has sort of given us an opportunity to see that having a de facto affordable housing program of crowding a bunch of people into what they can afford is not only really stressful and all these other, and leads to a difficult life. It would be hard for a kid to do their homework or anything in that kind of crowding. It also turns out to be really, really unsafe. And it turns out to be a public health hazard. And so hopefully we take this as year zero towards building a different world. And I think that it's impossible to imagine that the city of San Francisco could do that on its own.
Mhm.
It's impossible to imagine even that the state of California could do that on its own. And so, as Joe sort of said, I find myself somewhat depressed at times because I'm not sure how you can line all those things up to get the response that would be in proportion to what you would need. But in the meantime, I think San Francisco has done. I have not followed San Francisco's response other than reading your guide. I'm a Chronicle subscriber, of course, and it seems like it was reasonably good compared to a lot of other places, but it also has huge challenges and huge gaps, and people are trying to hold the city accountable for that, and I think that's good too. So we'll see how it all works out from here. But obviously, the crowded housing that I just described, the worst manifestation of it is homeless shelters and places like that. So figuring out how to get those folks into safer housing feels like a pretty important. I don't see how we could ever stop the transmission until that happened.
Mm. Well, thank you for subscribing to the Chronicle and for the plug. And I also liked what you said, that this could be year zero. I've been kind of thinking of it as the end time, so it's nice to hear that it could be the beginning of something better. But to just catch people up who aren't familiar with the response in San Francisco, the mayor did a great job, public health-wise, but there's been just this lag in figuring out what to do for homeless people who cannot shelter in place safely where they are. Many navigation centers and shelters have closed altogether or have severely limited the number of people they will have at any given time so that people can social distance. And so you literally cannot get into a shelter now from the street if you are homeless. Meanwhile, we have 30,000 hotel rooms that nobody is using because nobody's visiting. And so the city is paying for these rooms and yet not filling them. They are filling them with some of the older, medically vulnerable homeless people or people who've already had the virus or first responders who need kind of like a crash pad. But there's still thousands just sitting empty, and people are wondering why she's not getting homeless people into them faster. So maybe, Joe, you can take that question since I know you're very familiar with that scenario, and describe, what the mayor's thinking is and, your perspective on why more homeless people are not being moved inside those rooms.
Well, I wouldn't presume to be able to, ascertain the mayor's thinking, but, it does suggest that she's getting bad advice from somewhere. I think that, we have barely 10% of the available hotel rooms under contract. One has to ask the question why. That is, you kind of run out of plausible answers at a certain point, and frankly, with to everybody's point, certainly Zach's. I mean, poverty and homelessness are economic problems with economic solutions. Simple as that. A public health crisis has a health solution. So you want mass testing. You want everybody on the street gotten to safer housing as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. And even the prospect of flattening the curve, frankly, even that's inadequate, because flattening the curve only brings the rate of infection down to meet the capacity of an already overwhelmed healthcare system. So you need to build up from the base as well as flatten the curve. It gets hard to rationalize, who is actually making decisions. That seems less clear every day. I'm trying to give the mayor some leeway in that, at best, she's getting and taking bad advice. We need to get the healthy people off the ship now. So we got people on the street, get them into safer housing now, period. No more constructing these open air quarantine sites, these thinly disguised internment camps. While people are getting infected, spreading the infection, and dying. And I think that, if we didn't have alternative options, it would be easier to rationalize. But we do have better options, and we seem unwilling to take, to avail ourselves of those options, and that gets harder and harder to defend every day. Our shelter acted fairly quickly at the onset of this crisis to, we had an opportunity to move our shelter residents, the majority of our shelter residents, from our congregate setting to hotel rooms with private baths and hygiene facilities. We did that as quickly as we could. And as soon as we had an opportunity to do that, we did that. That was nearly 2 months ago. 2 months later, 2 of the people who chose not to relocate to hotel rooms are still in our shelter, waiting for a hotel room to be provided by the city. It still has not happened. And that is unconscionable. And it's hard then to say that, it's hard to square that with the Atlantic articles about how well, this administration and San Francisco is doing in the midst of this crisis. And the last thing I'll say, at least to this thread, is it's especially frustrating that during a public health crisis, frankly, the doctor should be the only one doing the talking, right? I mean, it's a public health crisis. Everybody else shuts up. And so that has not been the case. Other kind of voices are in the mix, and I think that has made things even more difficult in terms of settling on an actual policy and formulate that and then act on it quickly and expeditiously. So that's at least some of what we're seeing.
Who do you think the mayor is listening to if she's not listening only to doctors?
Yeah, you're pushing me here.
I like pushing you.
Thank you very much. I think that someone is making the decision about the economics versus the healthcare implications, and it's hard, not to arrive at that space. Someone saying that costs too much money. We don't need to do that, or we can't afford to do that. And I think that is misguided thinking. And frankly, we're going to pay for this one way or the other. And we have no idea where we are in our own trajectory in this COVID crisis. And it certainly doesn't feel like we're anywhere close to the apex of this. And so we should anticipate that the full costs of this have yet to be realized. And so if we don't start acting better and smarter and quicker, we will be the instruments of our own demise. And there will be very few people left to blame other than, the mayor's office.
And Zach, I wanted to ask you were speaking before about so many other types of inequality that we've been seeing play out for decades. And you said that, you never thought you'd have to be talking about inequality in a public health crisis when it's so obvious that we all would do better if we all took care of each other. It's, with a virus, everybody's health is related to everybody else's health. So why wouldn't we want everybody to be healthy? Can you speak to, there's that obvious fact, and yet there's still resistance in terms of treating everybody the same when it comes to COVID-19?
Yeah, and more specifically, I was talking about the choice between responding with a public health solution to a public health issue or responding with criminalization and with the criminal justice system. So a school child, acting out in the school could receive counseling in the school, or a police officer handcuffing them and taking them to the station. Someone who is homeless could receive the support they need to get into a home, or they could be taken to the jail. And what we've seen in this country is that it's not just the individual who is incarcerated or involved in the criminal justice system that is impacted by that decision. It is entire families and communities. It is women of color in particular who pay the cost of trying to support their loved ones who are cycling in and out of the system. And that criminal court system really becomes like economic quicksand, not just for that individual, but for their entire family. And what I would offer is just thinking specifically about San Francisco, if San Francisco is doing better or being lauded as doing well, it is only in relationship to the United States. And what I would offer is that we have a tendency to think that we're doing so well in the United States, we're this guiding light of democracy. I think increasingly we should see ourselves as a failed state as it relates to the amount of resources we have. We have really decimated infrastructure for public health, for our public schools, and we're seeing that play out right now. And so I brought up the example of the prison guard union going and talking to different localities across the state, because they were making an economic argument, but they were also making a government argument to say, we want you to leverage the power of the purse of the state. We want you to issue lease revenue bonds, these particular bonds that say, we'll pay you back if you invest in the prison system, we'll bring roads, etc. But prisons don't really have a return. And so this was a failed strategy for the state to put so much of its investment into a carceral system that has really undermined safety rather than increased it, and made it such that so many people, rather than getting the kinds of supports they need, are seen through this lens of criminalization. And that is especially true for communities of color.
Mm-hmm. And Conor, no discussion of housing and homelessness in the city would work without touching on NIMBYism, which is a big issue here in San Francisco. And we've seen that play out recently too. There was a homeless shelter for to get homeless people off the streets proposed for the Palace of Fine Arts. The Marina just fought back. Within a day, it was off the table. Now there's a safe camping site proposed in the Haight, which is traditionally a very liberal, progressive neighborhood. And neighbors there have filed a lawsuit to stop it and have hired a lawyer who is the co-chair of a group called Women for Donald Trump. Have you been surprised to find that even when in this, disastrous time when we need to help each other, that NIMBYism is still standing tall?
Not really. I think the premise of what I was looking at in my book and what I've kind of spent a lot of time on in my reporting on housing, not just in the Bay Area but nationally, is that NIMBYism is almost like the the water, right, or the air we breathe, or something. It's the predominant kind of mode, and this is not a partisan thing. You will find all sorts of ostensibly liberal people who will oppose, homes, affordable homes in their area. Flip side, you'll find all sorts of supposedly conservative people who will support any regulation and to raise the value of their own property, seemingly in opposition to their values of free markets and whatnot. So there's no easy red-blue with NIMBYism. And I think NIMBYism and all the inequity we see in San Francisco is often, you will hear all sorts of people on the right say, if this is so great, why does it look that way? And I think that people should think hard about that. So I think that it's not surprising. What I have seen in this crisis is people just using COVID as a means to harden whatever position they already had. So you see lots of people saying, well, we have a huge virus, we have a global pandemic. We need to build more housing because it's unsafe for people to be stuck in a lot of bedroom, or several people in one bedroom. You see other people saying, oh, well, this global pandemic shows why we shouldn't have apartment buildings because New York has a lot of COVID, right? And so everyone is just using this thing as a way to bolster their particular feeling about development in general. But I do think, so I guess the answer is I'm not surprised. It doesn't seem like crises like this it doesn't seem like they take people to go, and force them to go, oh, maybe I was like wrong all along. It's not like after 9/11, people who were very pro-war were like, oh, maybe this just shows that conflict begets conflict, and it's not, like there's not, it doesn't seem like crises push people to really question their assumptions. It seems to just harden them. Mm-hmm. But I do think sometimes, I think in a weird way, it's clarifying to see how bad things are in San Francisco. It's horrible. It's sad. It makes us feel like a failure. But maybe I was looking, somebody on Instagram the other day, this was in Los Angeles actually, but they did a picture. They were showing some real estate listing and it was like $1.5 million. And then they showed the Google Street View and there was like 4 tents next to it. And the person said, oh, this is the most Los Angeles home listing I've seen. And I thought to myself, well, maybe it's better that we have to sit there and wallow in our shame than if there was some, camp off in Tracy or something where all the homeless people, but I think that ultimately we're going to have to come to a better solution eventually. And people should eventually see the limits of these policies, because every day we walk. I mean, when I was on book tour, I was at this event in Seattle, and this woman asked this question. It was the only time anybody ever asked me this question, and she asked, "What do you think the cost is to all of our like souls?" It wasn't quite how she put it, but to just walk past this every day as if it's completely normal. We must be like killing ourselves or killing some little piece of our humanity every day to turn off whatever piece of us naturally wants to go like, oh my God, I can't believe, and I didn't have an answer. I just said, I think we should all just sit and think about that for a second. So anyway, I guess I'm not surprised that the answer is basically, I'm not surprised to see people do what they've always done, but I do have some optimism that the scale of this crisis and the embarrassment people should have about our wider Bay Area communities, role in not solving it should hopefully lead to some solution eventually. Let's just hope. But
let's hope. Joe, I wanted to ask you if you're hopeful that we're learning any lessons that will last in the long term, or are you just more frustrated than ever?
Well, I'm both. I don't think you could stay in this work for any length of time without being, an incurable optimist. If you weren't hopeful, it'd be difficult to get out of bed, particularly in the midst of something like this. I think, more than a few things are going to be necessary. One is kind of a collective woodshed conversation within our nonprofit sector about what we are and what we are not, and some level of honest and brutal critique about what we have contributed to. In many respects, the kind of the nonprofit industrial complex has for a long time been kind of a proxy for the structural racism and oppression that exists, and somehow making it palatable or at least acceptable in some ways. It's somebody's job. At least those do-gooders are trying to do something about that thing. And we actually haven't done very well. I think the implications of some of Zach's point about the criminal and justice system, 2 blocks from Hospitality House is a federal halfway house run by GeoCare, which is one of the 4 largest prison privatization firms in the world. Their business model is exploiting Black and brown people. That's what they do for a living. In the midst of a community that has among the highest booking rates of Black and brown people, we have allowed this for-profit corporation to commodify are community members who we are supposed to be welcoming back to the community. And the last thing that happens before we welcome them back to the community is that they get exploited again by GeoCare. That's hard to rationalize in the midst of a supposedly enlightened city. I think I am hopeful that there are voices who are raising the call about rethinking what we've been a party to reinvesting ourselves and reaffirming our founding commitment why we were drawn to this work in the first place, to there's something wrong in our society and it's our job to set that a little bit right. And I know for our organization, we're having some hard conversations about that, what that means for Hospitality House. And I do believe that, we do have an opportunity here to think about the possibilities of, a localized version of a Green New Deal. I mean, we have the infrastructure that make that possible. I mean, it requires a significant level of political will that has not seemed to exist for quite some time, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And this idea of setting ourselves on the better course of rebuilding our community infrastructure, to lifting up the assets that are already there in our community, to charting an alternative vision from the criminalization and the commodification of virtually everything. I mean, one of Zach's points about, how many cops we have in schools. I mean, truancy is a crime, right? So if a child is truant from school, the person that shows up at your door is a cop, not a counselor. School resource officers are police officers. They're not counselors. They're not school nurses. They're not guidance counselors. That's what we need in our schools, where across the board, so many of our resources and the pillars of our community building infrastructure are now firmly rooted in the criminal justice system. We can predict with a fair degree of certainty the life chances of preschoolers. We are suspending Black kids from preschool at a rate that's 3.5 times higher than white kids. And, aside from the lunacy of suspending or expelling preschoolers for failure to nap, I guess. But it is very intentional and it is very deliberate. You're exposing, certain children of color as early as possible to the criminal justice system, and you are setting them on a path that leads to a preordained conclusion. We can interrupt that. We can make a decision that we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to squander our resources on more weapons of mass destruction. We're not going to squander our resources on constructing prisons that are, frankly, you can make an argument that the Department of Justice is now the largest developer of affordable housing in the country. That is absolute insanity, and we know that. We can do something about that. It does require, though, that we marshal some level of collective will to say that we are no longer going to accept that. We are going to chart an alternative vision here. I think organizations like Hospitality House have a very important role to play in the community as an institution that was founded by community volunteers to kind of lift up and promote and celebrate the best of what communities can be. That's what I'm rededicating myself to.
Joe, I think maybe you should run for political office.
Time's passed, I think, but.
Zach, are you finding any reason to be optimistic about all this? Are we learning any lessons that will set us in good stead to cope down the road from the pandemic?
I would say yes and no. So Do I find reason to be optimistic? Yes. Do I feel like we're learning lessons? Probably not. I think this is a pretty arrogant nation as a whole, and we don't take lessons easily, and I think that's true in the Bay Area. So I'll start with the no part of the answer and come back to the yes. Look at the history of the Bay Area. My dad's African American, my mom's white. They located in East Oakland partly because there was a racially restrictive covenant in San Leandro well into the 1980s, right? And so this wasn't just NIMBYism based on poverty. This is just straight up racial discrimination. It was nationally known. There were studies and affirmations of this. And then we have, the history of West Oakland and people being displaced to locate the BART train system along 7th Street. Businesses displaced, homeowners displaced. I myself almost lost my home that my dad and I bought to the foreclosure crisis around 2008, right? And that was one of the largest losses of Black wealth in the history of this country. And that was just 10 years ago. So I think we don't have to go back so far to really think about how governments could repair the harm that they have caused to the same communities that are now disproportionately suffering from COVID, disproportionately suffering from criminalization, disproportionately homeless. We could actually develop government programs that said, that map that we look at that shows redlining in the East Bay and San Francisco, we could just overlay that map and say, this history is what caused some of these outcomes. We're going to have remedial programs. We're going to create some community-based housing, some shared housing in specific districts to begin to remedy the problem that is partly government induced and partly government caused. And so that's the part where I'm not yet optimistic that I think those kinds of things will happen. Given, quite frankly, the state of affairs nationally, but also just people aren't really having those more transformative conversations around what it would really take to address a long history of racial injustice in this country or in this state. Though I'm not as optimistic about that, I do think that economic crisis force really hard decisions. And some of the work that we have been doing to challenge criminalization is starting to see fruit because of this economic crisis. So as an organization at the Ella Baker Center, and this is described in my book, We Keep Us Safe, we fought an over a decade-long campaign to close 5 of 8 youth prisons across the state of California. Youth prisons that were abusing young people, that families were traveling hundreds of miles to see their kids. And it was basically just preparing these youth for the adult prison system. It was a failure in every regard. We were able to get 5 of those 8 youth prisons closed. And guess what? Youth crime continued to decline during that same period. So this was not just a win for human rights for those families. It was a win for all of our safety. Because when young people are surrounded by the supports they need, guess what? They do better. Now the governor is saying we need to close the last 3 of those youth prisons and close 2 adult prisons. And I quite frankly think that is a welcome first step to beginning to reassess our priorities as a state and beginning to move resources back towards a social safety net and away from this criminal dragnet that has actually made us less safe, less secure, and worsened cycles of poverty and incarceration. So am I like wildly optimistic? No, but I'm not supposed to be, right? We have to be sober in our analysis. I do think that there are opportunities to be hopeful, and we have to seize on those opportunities and take advantage of them.
I thought we could each ask each of you to share a myth that you think exists around homelessness, housing, or inequality. And Conor, anything come to mind for you?
I think that the mental health story is oversold. I don't think it's inaccurate, so I wouldn't go so far as to call it a myth, but I think it's oversold, and that a homelessness is pretty much straight up a poverty program, or sorry, a poverty problem. This gets a little bit wonky, but there is this really fascinating series of economic and sociological papers that show that a huge amount of the homeless population is concentrated amongst this like late baby boomer people born between I think it's 55 and 65, and that these are people who have been uniquely positioned to be hurt by every single, so they would have come of age right when the 80s recession was there. And that we've read a lot of articles recently about how people who enter, leave their homes and enter work life in a really down period, as is happening today, tend to be more vulnerable for life. It's shocking. If you go look at pictures, I'm sure Joe could back this up. If you go look at pictures of homeless shelters from the 80s, the people are quite a bit younger. And then they get progressively older in the 90s and the 2000s. And it's sort of this same group of people who've been on the backs, who just really were just basically like left out because the economy just like wasn't doing, they were basically just thrown out because there weren't that many jobs then. And, it's not to say they were all homeless their whole lives. Obviously, most people only experience homelessness for a fairly short period. And a lot of them happened after 50. But anyway, my point is that when I look at all sorts of different stuff, be it historical and otherwise, it just looks like it's not to say we wouldn't have people having mental challenges on the streets if we'd solve those other problems, but I do not think we would have I think the roots of our homeless crisis, and the reason it's 500,000 people and not 10, 20,000 people, is largely an economic problem. And I know you and I and Joe and Zach all kind of know this, but every single time I write an article, the comments light up with people who go, you shouldn't talk about this in relation to housing costs. This is a mental health problem. This is, so no matter how many times this myth is dispelled, it doesn't seem like it ever quite takes hold.
Right. And I think that people get confused because we do see a lot of mental health problems on the streets, but often that's caused because people have been homeless on the streets for so long. And lack of sleep and lack of healthcare adds to, any of us don't feel ourselves if we haven't slept well, in a few nights. And if you're outside for years, that's going to get even worse. So, Zach, do you have a myth you would like to share?
A response to that is just, I think that one of the things that I believe to be true is that prisons exacerbate mental health problems. And so I think to the extent that people are cycling in and out of institutions where they're caged, that's not going to be helpful for anybody's mental health. And I guess the myth, I don't know if it's a myth that any of you all would be shocked by, but I think a lot of people think, well, it's just too expensive to solve this problem, right? And my reality is, looking at the gobs of money that we spend on prisons and cycling people in and out of prison, it doesn't feel like an insurmountable problem given the amount of resources we've put towards incarcerating people. And as Joe said, creating, the largest affordable housing, quote unquote, program in the country. So I think it's really a matter of political will, and it's going to take some doing, but I think there were some intentional steps that, as Conor was saying, started in the 1970s in some ways to really shrink government, and what I like to describe as like a death-like government, because we fund all of the things that disproportionately cause people death. Warfare and prisons accelerate people's morbidity. Police, are supposed to keep us safe, but we've seen that, police officers can't be social workers, can't be housing coordinators, And to put all of those social problems on one entity is not fair to any individual. And, there's a long history of racism inside of police stations as well. So we really need to rethink how we respond to issues that are in plain sight and all around us. And so that for me is the opportunity, is to reinvest those resources.
And Joe, do you have a myth that comes to mind when it comes to homelessness?
Well, some variation of it's the person's fault, right? So it's kind of some product of individual pathology, behavioral pathology, rather than rooted in economics, and that is deeply ingrained. I mean, that has been. I mean, one example we use in our discussion circles are talking about the Elizabethan poor laws of 17th century, with kind of the demise or transition from a feudal system. There was very much a focus in localities around controlling the movement of vagrants. And there was very much, kind of the religious implications of poverty as the comment on one's spiritual worth. And that has remained with us, centuries and centuries later. I mean, it's hard to look at a homeless person and not feel that, they've been doing something wrong in their life. And that's why they round up on the street. And so I think our organization, and certainly, tens of, organizations going to see every day the myth of that. Does that absolve people of their own responsibility and their own success or failure? No, it does not. It's just not. We are very careful about connecting problem to solution. And I'd also say, in terms of, I think that, frankly, we feel that kind of the national estimates of 500,000 plus people, that's pretty low in terms of the homeless population. And, even in San Francisco, it is kind of universally acknowledged that upwards of 20,000 plus people, like close to 25,000 people, experience at least one episode of homelessness in the course of a year. And so the people we count on January 1st who are homeless, December 31st is not going to be the same, 5,000 or 8,000 people, right? And so, and I think if you look at kind of the collective weight or the collective inadequacy or the collective wrong-headed decision-making, kind of, across multiple systems, you have a recipe for deep levels of poverty and homelessness. So at least one myth, I believe, is that it's the person's fault. It's the individual's fault that they're homeless. And frankly, this COVID crisis has actually made that front and center, with our Surgeon General, lecturing us on if, Black people just took care of themselves better, they wouldn't get sick. Thank you very much. I appreciate that from the Surgeon General. So.
Wow. Well, I thought we're coming up on the end of our time together, but I thought maybe we could end on a positive note. I think everybody feels better when they feel like they have some control over a situation or something positive to add. So if we could all share one thing we can do to make a difference when it comes to homelessness and the misery that we see on the streets every day here in the Bay Area, if you can each share one good thing a listener could do. And we'll start with Conor.
Wow. Something somebody could do. I feel a little, I guess they can just be involved. I feel like I think that if there's one thing I'm trying to kind of remember when I see all these things, like policing or housing or education, these really intractable issues of our time, there's a federal component. It's not to say there isn't, but these are local services. I mean, I saw this, I'm sure a lot of people saw this, but there's a clip going around of Wyatt Cenac from several years ago, but talking about policing and saying, this is a service. This is something we pay for. We pay for somebody to do this thing for us, and we do need some amount of law enforcement. But kind of like when you walk into a restaurant, if the service isn't very good, you get to say something about it, and it feels like that's missing. Anyway, this is all just a kind of wandering way of saying, whether it's housing or police or education, particularly those things, these are local government problems that we have a startling amount of control over. We don't have to worry about who the next president is to make huge changes in those in those areas that we see as being some of the most intractable of our time. So I guess my advice to people is to get involved, because unlike who the majority leader is or who your president is, which are things that you have only a limited amount of control over, particularly in California, where there's not a lot of question which way the voters here will vote for people in Washington. You can have like a huge amount of just a pretty minimal amount of involvement and awareness and subscribing to the Chronicle and learning about all these things going on around you. That you can have a huge impact on these issues. They're not out of your control. Again, foreign wars, things like that, maybe that is a little harder. You might have to move to Washington or get really involved to have an impact on that. But these issues are so within people's control. And I think remembering that, whether it's involvement in a nonprofit or just being a more informed voter, you don't have to feel paralyzed about these issues the way you do so many others.
And Zach, do you have any words of wisdom for people who want to make a difference?
Sure. I would summarize it by saying think differently and act differently. So think differently. I would encourage people to think about the distinction between crime and harm. In our society, we've tended to focus our attention in terms of the criminal court system on this idea of crime, but we focus more on crime on the streets than we do in terms of crime in the suites. We don't think about really holding those large actors accountable who created the recession that led to the largest loss of Black wealth in the history of this country. And so we have to get active and engaged in order to bring those levels of accountability. And that plays out in the lives of everyday people. In my book, I focus on the story of Anita. And Anita de Assis, while she was in college, her mother died. She was gang raped at UC Santa Barbara. They were raising the fees at her school. She was trying to fight that as a student activist, but then at the same time dealing with all of this trauma in her life. She ended up getting kind of pushed out of school, ended up homeless for a time. She worked with her daughter to actually feed other homeless folks, and then organized this whole housing and dignity village to provide some basic, living conditions for women and their families in particular. And I think her heroism and her determination is some of what people can take away, and really focus on supporting organizations that are doing that work on the front lines, advocating for change, supporting people who are homeless, like the work that Joe is doing, supporting the work of the Ella Baker Center. We're working to challenge the criminalization of homelessness. Right now, there's been sort of a pause on some of that more active sweeps and displacing homeless people from one place to another, these kind of city ordinances that really just focus to just really serve to criminalize homeless people. If there is one opportunity in this moment, it's for that to never be the case again, that we should never have that kind of law enforcement response that just worsens the cycle of poverty and incarceration. So I think that there are community-based organizations that people can actually support, and that's the acting differently. And I think people should begin to think differently about what are the greatest harms in our society, and not just kind of point to that person on the corner in the way that I think the powers that be want us to kind of divide and conquer ourselves, but rather really look at some of the systemic issues behind what we see on our street corners, and really hold those systemic level actors accountable. And that really requires getting politically engaged.
Well said. And Joe, we'll end with you. What is something that a listener can do to make a difference?
I think something Conor said earlier about the remarks around feeling that pieces of our soul are being chipped away. I guess I would remind us all just to remember what it means to be human, to give ourselves both permission and encouragement to suspend judgment about other human beings. I know that when I was on the street, kind of the judgment in people's eyes hurt very deeply, because it seemed like a mirror into your own soul and your own sense of worthlessness, and feeling less human. And that's a kind of trauma that you don't heal from that very easily. So I would just encourage us to remember what it means to be human, and in the midst of, I think we're at a very, threshold moment in this society where, in so many ways, it has just become far too easy to be cold and callous and cruel to each other. So if there's one thing that I would encourage people to stop is, don't do that. Mm-hmm. Don't be cold, don't be cruel, don't be callous. And that can mean a number of things. Someone asks you for money, give them money, or not give them money. That's still fine. But just be mindful of our judgment, the value that we impose upon other people and how oppressive that can be. And I would hope that as a community, as a city, as a country, we could gradually start moving away from that and back closer toward each other. Those are the kinds of things that really frighten me on a daily basis, is how easy we can be inhuman to other human beings. So I would plead with everyone listening, please don't do that. Be gentle. Try to be understanding. If you were in this situation, or if you fell on hard times, what would you want others to do for you? What would you want others to think about you? And try to at least be just a little bit of that as often as you can.
I think that's a really important point. I've interviewed many homeless people who've told me that they'll go so long without anybody looking them in the eye or saying hello that they start to feel like a ghost, or wonder if they're even there, because nobody has acknowledged their existence in days or a week. So just, they've told me that saying hello, smiling, looking them in the eye can make a difference. And some people have told me they've tried to talk to people about the littlest things like the weather or ask what time it is, and people will just like recoil and not even want to answer a simple question. So I think that's a great point to end on. You guys were all very eloquent and informative, so thanks for talking today. Thank you to Conor Dougherty, Zach Norris, and Joe Wilson for joining us. At the end of this talk, there will be a link where you can buy Golden Gates and We Keep Us Safe and have them shipped directly to you. I'm Heather Knight, and you've been watching Bay Area Book Festival Unbound.